How medieval peasants survived plague, famine, and feudal rule. Boring history for sleep. Imagine living in a world where sleep offered no safety, food was never guaranteed, and death walked openly through the village roads. This was not a nightmare, it was daily life for medieval peasants. In the Middle Ages, survival was not about ambition or comfort. It was about enduring plague without medicine, famine without relief, and feudal lords without mercy. Ordinary men, women, and children lived under crushing systems they could not escape, yet, somehow, they survived. This is not a story of kings or knights. This is the quiet, overlooked history of peasants, the backbone of medieval society, who endured disease, hunger, violence, and fear with resilience forged in darkness. Welcome to Ancient History Stories, where story is history and history is life. Tonight, we uncover how medieval peasants survived plague, famine, and feudal rule, slowly, quietly, and against impossible odds. Chapter 1. Born into Survival, a Peasant's First Breath. A medieval peasant was not born into the world the way we imagine birth today. There was no quiet hospital room, no soft light, no expectation that life would be gentle or fair. A peasant's first breath was taken in a place already heavy with danger, scarcity, and uncertainty. Survival was not learned later in life, it was the condition of existence from the very beginning. Imagine a small timber and wattle hut on the edge of a village in medieval England. The year is uncertain because peasants rarely counted time as we do. What matters is the season. Winter is fading, but cold still clings to the ground. Inside the hut, smoke hangs low from a central hearth that never fully goes out. The air smells of damp earth, old straw, sweat, and wood ash. This is where life begins. A child is born on a bed of straw, not because straw is comfortable, but because it is available. The mother is surrounded by women from the village, neighbors, relatives, perhaps a midwife with knowledge passed down through generations, not books. There are no doctors, no antiseptics, no certainty that either mother or child will survive the night. Infant mortality is a silent companion in every household. Many children will never see their 5th birthday. Everyone in the room understands this, even if they never speak it aloud. When the baby cries, it is not just a sound of life, it is proof of victory, for now. From the very first moment, the peasant child's body is shaped by the world around it. Cold winters mean weak immune systems face constant threats. Hunger is not an occasional inconvenience, it is a recurring reality. Most peasants live on the edge of malnutrition, their diets dominated by coarse bread, thin pottage, and whatever vegetables can survive poor soil and unpredictable weather. Meat is rare, milk is precious, sugar is unknown. A peasant's birth does not come with dreams of upward mobility. Society is rigid, structured by feudalism, a system where land defines power and power defines destiny. The child is born into a role already written. If the parents are serfs, tied to a lord's land, then the child will almost certainly be the same. Freedom is not an abstract ideal, it is a privilege seen only in others. Even before the child can walk, survival training begins, not through lessons, but through environment. The hut is crowded. People sleep together for warmth. Parents, children, sometimes grandparents, sometimes animals. Privacy does not exist. Nights are long and dark, broken only by firelight and fear. Wolves howl in the distance. The wind slips through cracks in the walls. Every sound could mean danger. Disease is everywhere, unseen and unstoppable. Long before the Black Death will later devastate Europe, peasants already live with constant illness, fevers, infections, parasites. Clean water is not guaranteed. Waste is close, flies are constant, a simple cut can become fatal. Mothers whisper prayers not just during childbirth, but every morning their child wakes up. Religion shapes a peasant's understanding of survival. Life is fragile, so meaning is found in faith. God is not distant, God is immediate, powerful, and sometimes terrifying. If a child survives infancy, it is seen as divine mercy. If a child dies, it is God's will. This belief is not cruelty, it is emotional armor. Without it, grief would be unbearable. From infancy, a peasant child observes labor. Fields are plowed by hand or with oxen. Harvests depend on weather that no one can control. A bad season means famine. A good season means relief, not abundance. Children learn quickly that food is never wasted. Crumbs matter, leftovers matter. Survival is a communal effort. The Lord's presence is felt even if he is rarely seen. Taxes are owed in grain, labor, and obedience. A peasant child grows up knowing that their body will someday belong partly to the land and partly to the Lord who owns it. This knowledge is absorbed quietly, without rebellion, because rebellion means punishment, and punishment can mean starvation or death. Yet, even in this harsh beginning, there is resilience. Peasant families love their children deeply, even if affection looks different from modern expectations. Love is practical. Love is teaching a child how to endure cold. Love is feeding them first when food is scarce. Love is telling stories at night to distract them from hunger and fear. A peasant's first breath is taken in a world that offers no safety net, no promises, and no escape. But it is also taken in a world where endurance is normal, where community is survival, and life, however hard, is fiercely protected. This is not the beginning of a heroic journey. It is the beginning of a long negotiation with hunger, disease, power, and time. To be born a peasant is to be born already fighting. And this fight will only grow harder. Chapter 2. The Feudal Trap. Life under Lords and Land. By the time a peasant child learned to speak, the most important truth of their life had already been decided. The land owned them. Not in a poetic sense, not as a metaphor, but in a legal, economic, and physical reality shaped by feudalism. To be born a peasant was to be born into a system designed to extract labor, obedience, and silence, generation after generation. Feudalism was not experienced as a theory, it was lived as routine. The village itself existed only because of the Lord's land. The fields, the forests, the streams, even the dirt beneath bare feet were part of an estate controlled by someone far above the peasant's social position. The Lord might live in a manor house or a distant castle, but his presence was constant. It was felt in the rules, the taxes, the obligations, and the fear of punishment. Most peasants were serfs, not free farmers. A serf could not leave the land without permission. They could not sell their labor freely. They could not choose a different life. If their parents worked the fields, they would work the fields. If their parents died owing labor or grain, that debt could follow the family. Feudalism ensured continuity, not of prosperity, but of control. From childhood, peasants learned the rhythm of obligation. Several days each week were owed to the Lord as unpaid labor. This was called corvée. On those days, peasants did not tend their own small plots. Instead, they repaired roads, plowed the Lord's fields, harvested his crops, or carried supplies. Only after the Lord's needs were met could they work to feed themselves. This imbalance shaped every decision. If a peasant family's crops failed, the Lord's taxes did not disappear. Grain was still owed, labor was still demanded. The system had no mercy mechanism. Hunger was not considered an emergency, it was considered the peasant's problem. Justice, too, belonged to the Lord. Minor disputes were settled in manorial courts where peasants rarely won against authority. Fines were common. Punishments could include public humiliation, loss of land access, or imprisonment. Violence was not constant, but it was always possible, and that possibility kept order. The peasant child growing into adolescence learned that obedience was safer than resistance. Stories of rebellion existed, whispered quietly, but they usually ended in suffering. A lord had armed men, a peasant had hands hardened by labor, and a body weakened by poor nutrition. The imbalance was absolute. Yet feudalism was not only enforced through fear, it was normalized through tradition. This is how it has always been, elders would say. The land gives food, the Lord protects the land, God approves the order. These beliefs formed a mental cage as strong as any physical boundary. Religion reinforced the trap. The church taught that social hierarchy was divinely ordained. Lords ruled because God allowed it. Peasants labored because it was their place. Obedience was framed as virtue. Suffering was framed as a test. In this worldview, questioning feudalism was not just dangerous, it was sinful. Still, peasants were not mindless victims. They understood exploitation, even if they lacked the power to escape it. They negotiated where they could. They hid small portions of grain. They shared tools and labor to survive bad seasons. Community became a quiet form of resistance, not against the Lord directly, but against total collapse. Land was both enemy and lifeline. A peasant's identity was tied to the soil they worked. The same field that demanded endless labor also provided the only chance at survival. This created a complex emotional bond, resentment mixed with dependence, exhaustion mixed with gratitude. As the peasant child grew, they learned to measure time not in years, but in harvests. A good harvest meant temporary relief. A bad harvest meant fear. And looming over every season was the Lord's claim, unavoidable and non-negotiable. Feudalism did not need chains. It used hunger, law, and belief instead. By adulthood, the peasant no longer questioned why life felt like an endless struggle. Struggle was the design. The trap was complete. Not because peasants were weak, but because the system was. And beyond the fields, unseen but approaching, were threats that feudalism could not control: famine, disease, and death. Chapter 3: When Food Failed. Medieval Famine and Hunger. For a medieval peasant, hunger was never a distant fear. It lived close, just one bad season away. Even in good years, food was fragile. It depended on rain that arrived on time, on seeds that sprouted evenly, on tools that did not break, and on bodies strong enough to work the land day after day. When any part of that chain failed, hunger followed. And when hunger arrived, it did not come quietly. A peasant family's survival rested almost entirely on the harvest. Their small strips of land, scattered across open fields, produced barley, rye, oats, peas, and beans. Wheat, the finest grain, was often reserved for the Lord or the church. What peasants ate was coarse, heavy, and repetitive. Bread made from dark flour, mixed with chaff and grit. Thin porridge cooked slowly over the hearth. Vegetables when available. Meat only on rare occasions, often salted or dried long before it reached the pot. There was no surplus, no pantry stacked for years ahead. Most families lived harvest to harvest. Grain stored in bins or sacks had to last until the next growing season, and every scoop mattered. Children were taught early never to waste food. A dropped crust was picked up. A burnt pot of porridge was scraped clean. Hunger shaped habits, manners, and morals. When famine struck, it reshaped everything. Famine did not always mean sudden emptiness. Often it began subtly. Rain came too late, frost lingered too long, crops grew thin and weak. At first, peasants rationed quietly. Portions became smaller, meals fewer. Parents ate less so children could eat more. But as weeks turned into months, the signs became impossible to hide. Bodies weakened, faces hollowed, work slowed just when more labor was needed. Hunger stole strength, and without strength, survival became harder. It was a cruel loop. The land demanded energy, but hunger drained it away. In severe famines, desperation followed. Peasants gathered wild plants, nettles, roots, bark, anything that could be boiled into something resembling food. Horses and oxen, essential for plowing, were slaughtered as a last resort. This provided short-term relief, but long-term disaster. Without animals, future harvests were doomed. Disease thrived during famine. Malnutrition weakened immune systems. Simple illnesses became deadly. Children and the elderly were the first to die, but no one was truly safe. Entire villages could shrink in a single year, homes left empty, fields abandoned. The Great Famine of the early 14th century would later become infamous, but even before it, cycles of hunger were common. Peasants understood famine as part of life, not an exception. What terrified them was not whether famine would come, but when. The feudal system offered little protection. Lords still demanded rents and labor. In some cases, grain stores existed, but access was controlled. Relief, if it came, was selective and often strategic. Hunger reinforced power. A peasant dependent on the lord for survival was easier to control. Religion again shaped understanding. Famine was explained as divine punishment or a test from God. Sermons urged repentance, prayer, and obedience. For many peasants, this belief provided meaning, but it also removed blame from human systems that worsened suffering. Weather was blamed, God was blamed, rarely the structure of society. Inside the peasant home, famine changed relationships. Parents faced impossible choices. Who eats today? Who waits until tomorrow? Love did not disappear, but it became painful. Survival demanded hard decisions. The emotional toll was as severe as the physical one. Yet even in famine, communities tried to hold together. Food was shared when possible. Neighbors watched each other's children. Stories were told at night to distract from empty stomachs. Folklore grew darker, filled with spirits, curses, and warnings, reflecting a world where hunger felt supernatural in its cruelty. For children born into famine, hunger was normal. They learned to live with it the way modern people live with noise or stress. Their bodies adapted, growing smaller, tougher, but more vulnerable. Survival was measured not by comfort, but by endurance. When famine finally eased, when rains returned or harvests improved, the relief was temporary. No feast followed. There was only cautious breathing space and unspoken knowledge that hunger would return someday. For medieval peasants, food was never guaranteed. It was negotiated daily with soil, weather, labor, and power. And every full stomach was understood not as a right, but as a blessing. But hunger was only one enemy. Another, invisible and far more terrifying, was waiting, one that would not just starve bodies, but empty entire worlds. The plague was coming. Chapter 4. Bread, Gruel, and Hope. What Peasants Really Ate. After hunger, after the fear of empty fields and failed harvests, food, when it existed, became the center of a peasant's universe. Not food as pleasure, not food as choice, but food as survival. For medieval peasants, eating was not about variety or taste, it was about endurance. Every meal was a calculation, every ingredient a quiet victory over starvation. The foundation of a peasant's diet was bread, but not the soft white loaves we imagine today. Peasant bread was dense, dark and heavy. It was made from rye, barley, or oats, often mixed together, because pure wheat was expensive and usually claimed by the Lord or the church. The flour was coarse, ground in communal mills that peasants were often forced to use for a fee paid back to the Lord. Even bread carried the weight of feudal control. This bread was so hard that it could last for days, sometimes weeks. Fresh bread was rare. Most of the time, loaves grew stale quickly, becoming difficult to chew. But nothing was wasted. Old bread was soaked in water, ale, or broth to make it edible again. In many homes, bread was not just food, it was a utensil. Thick slices were used as trenchers, holding stew or gruel, absorbing liquid until they themselves became the meal. Alongside bread came gruel and pottage. These were not specific recipes, but flexible mixtures, whatever could be spared, thrown into a pot and boiled slowly over the hearth. Grain, peas, beans, onions, cabbage, leeks, turnips, anything that could grow in poor soil or be foraged nearby. Meat was rare and usually absent. When it did appear, it was often salted or smoked, added in small amounts for flavor rather than nourishment. The hearth was the heart of the home. One pot often hung there all day, simmering endlessly. Ingredients were added when available, removed when eaten. This constant cooking reduced waste and made tough foods digestible. Children learned early that the pot was life itself. When it was full, there was hope. When it was empty, fear returned. Protein was scarce. Milk came from cows or goats, but dairy production depended on healthy animals and enough pasture. Cheese was more common than fresh milk because it lasted longer. Eggs were valuable and often saved. Fish, where rivers or coasts allowed, became a crucial supplement, especially during religious fasts when meat was forbidden. Even then, access depended on geography and lordly permission. Vegetables were essential, but seasonal. Gardens near the home provided onions, garlic, herbs, and greens. These were not luxuries, they were medicine as much as food. Garlic was believed to protect against illness. Herbs were used to ease pain, settle stomachs, and ward off evil. Nutrition and superstition blended seamlessly. Hunger shaped taste. Peasants did not expect food to be exciting, they expected it to keep them alive. A warm bowl of pottage after a day in the fields was comfort enough. Warmth itself was nourishment. Eating hot food meant the hearth was lit, the home intact, the family together. Alcohol played a surprising role. Weak ale was safer than water, which was often contaminated. Even children drank diluted ale. It provided calories and hydration. Brewing was common, often done by women, and a bad batch could mean sickness or wasted grain. A good batch meant survival through another week. Religion controlled food as well. The church dictated fasting days, sometimes up to a third of the year, when meat, dairy, and eggs were forbidden. For peasants already living on the edge, these rules reinforced discipline and hierarchy. Yet many adapted quietly, finding loopholes or substituting fish and plants. Survival often required flexibility beneath obedience. Meals were communal. Families ate together, often from the same bowl. This reinforced bonds and minimized waste. Children learned their place quickly. Elders were respected, but when food was scarce, decisions became painful. Who eats first? Who eats last? Love was present, but hunger forced hard truths. Despite scarcity, food carried emotional meaning. A full pot after weeks of thin gruel felt like celebration. A successful harvest brought cautious joy. Festivals, rare moments, allowed peasants to eat more freely. These days stood out sharply against the monotony of survival eating. What peasants ate was not glamorous, but it sustained civilizations. Their bodies, built on bread and gruel, cleared forests, tilled land, and supported entire social orders. Their food was simple, but their endurance was extraordinary. Yet even the most careful planning could not protect them forever. Food could vanish overnight. A single unseen enemy could turn full villages into silent ones. And soon that enemy would arrive, not through fields, but through breath, blood, and fear. The plague was closer than anyone knew. Chapter 5. The Black Death arrives. Fear without understanding. When the Black Death arrived, it did not announce itself with certainty or clarity. There were no warnings, no explanations, no understanding of what was happening or why. It came quietly at first, carried along roads, rivers, ships, and rumors. By the time medieval peasants realized something was terribly wrong, death was already among them. For generations, peasants had lived with sickness. Fever, coughs, infections, these were familiar enemies. Illness was expected, even accepted. But this was different. This sickness moved faster, it killed more completely, and it did not respect age, strength, or status. The first signs were confusing. Someone complained of fatigue, then pain. Swellings appeared, dark, painful lumps in the groin, under the arms, along the neck. Fever followed, burning and relentless. Skin darkened, breath grew shallow. Within days, sometimes hours, the victim was dead. Families watched in disbelief as healthy people collapsed without warning. No one knew what caused it. Germs were unknown. Bacteria and fleas were beyond imagination. To the medieval mind, the plague had to mean something. God's anger, poisoned air, a curse carried by strangers, an alignment of planets. Every explanation was terrifying because none offered control. Fear spread faster than the disease itself. Villages began to change overnight. Doors stayed closed, neighbors avoided each other, markets emptied, fields went unworked, not because peasants refused to labor, but because there were not enough people left to do so. The sound of church bells, once markers of time and prayer, became signals of death, ringing again and again for funerals that soon overwhelmed priests and graveyards. Peasants faced impossible choices. Should they stay and risk infection, or flee and risk starvation? Movement could save a life, or spread death further. Some villages isolated themselves, barring outsiders. Others collapsed completely, as survivors abandoned homes in panic. The Black Death did not strike evenly. Some households lost one member, others lost everyone. Children died beside parents. Grandparents outlived the young. There was no logic, no fairness. This randomness was perhaps the most terrifying aspect. Survival felt arbitrary. Religion offered explanations, but no solutions. Clergy urged repentance, prayer, and processions. Some peasants believed the plague was punishment for sin. Others believed it marked the end of the world. Flagellants marched from town to town, whipping themselves in public, believing pain could appease God. These displays frightened villagers as much as they inspired them. Medical knowledge was almost non-existent. Treatments ranged from useless to harmful. Bloodletting weakened bodies further. Herbal remedies failed. Fires were lit to cleanse the air. Perfumes were worn to mask imagined poisons. None of it stopped the dying. Inside medieval peasant homes, terror became intimate. Families slept together not just for warmth, but for fear of dying alone. Every cough was suspicious. Every ache was a warning. Sleep became restless.
haunted by the knowledge that morning might not come.
Work ceased to matter. Feudal obligations collapsed under the weight of death. Lords fled to countryside estates or walled towns. Manorial courts stopped functioning. Fields lay unplowed. Grain rotted. Hunger followed disease, compounding the disaster. Yet even in this chaos, peasants continued to care for each other. Mothers nursed sick children, knowing it might kill them. Neighbors buried the dead when priests could not. Simple acts of kindness persisted, quiet and brave, even when hope was scarce. The psychological impact was profound. Survivors were changed forever. They had seen death without meaning or mercy. They had learned that obedience, faith, and labor offered no protection against unseen forces. The old certainties cracked. For a peasant who survived the Black Death, life afterward felt unreal. Villages were quieter, fields were emptier, the familiar rhythms of survival were broken. And yet life continued, not because it made sense, but because it had to. The Black Death did not just kill bodies, it shattered assumptions. It exposed how little control peasants truly had over their world. And when the dying finally slowed, something unexpected began to emerge from the ruins, something that would quietly reshape power itself. Scarcity of people would soon matter more than scarcity of food. The world after the plague would never be the same. Chapter 6. Living with Death. Daily Life During the Plague. Once the Black Death settled into daily reality, fear stopped being an event and became an atmosphere. It was no longer just something that arrived from outside. It lived inside homes, inside routines, inside every breath taken too deeply. Medieval peasants did not experience the plague as a single catastrophe, but as a long, grinding transformation of everyday life. Morning still came, the sun still rose, but nothing felt the same. A peasant waking during the plague did so with a question already forming in the mind. Who will die today? It might be a neighbor, it might be a child, it might be the person lying beside them. Death had become unpredictable, intimate, and constant. The line between the living and the dead felt dangerously thin. Villages grew quiet in unnatural ways. The usual sounds, children shouting, animals moving, tools striking soil, faded. In their place came coughing, crying, and the low murmur of prayers whispered from behind closed doors. Bells rang so often that they lost meaning. Some villages stopped ringing them altogether, unable to keep pace with the dead. Daily labor became fragmented. Fields were left half-worked, crops spoiled because there were not enough hands to harvest them. Peasants who remained healthy faced an impossible dilemma. Work meant exposure to others, but not working meant starvation. Survival required risk, and every risk carried the shadow of infection. Inside peasant homes, routines adapted to death. Bedding was moved closer to the hearth for warmth and comfort. Possessions were reduced. Anything unnecessary felt dangerous. Clothing of the dead was often burned or abandoned, even though fabric was precious. Fear outweighed scarcity. Children grew up fast. They watched siblings fall ill. They learned the smell of sickness. Games disappeared. Silence took their place. Parents tried to shield them, but there was no hiding death when it entered the home. Caregiving was both an act of love and a potential death sentence. When someone showed symptoms, families faced brutal choices. Some isolated the sick, hoping to save the rest. Others stayed close, refusing to abandon loved ones, even if it meant sharing their fate. There was no correct decision, only consequences. Burial practices collapsed under the weight of numbers. Individual graves became mass pits. Rituals shortened. Priests were overwhelmed or dead themselves. Many peasants buried family members without ceremony, marking graves with stones or memory alone. Grief had no time to rest. Survival demanded attention. Religion, once a source of comfort, became complicated. Some peasants prayed more fervently than ever, clinging to faith as the only explanation left. Others felt abandoned. Why would God spare some and not others? Why children? Why the faithful? These questions lingered silently, rarely spoken aloud. Superstition flourished in the absence of understanding. Amulets were worn, charms were hung above doors, fires were kept burning to cleanse the air. Certain days were avoided, certain people were feared. Outsiders, travelers, and strangers were treated with suspicion, sometimes violence. Yet community did not vanish entirely. In many villages, shared suffering created new bonds. Survivors relied on one another more than ever. Food was shared, work was redistributed, orphans were taken in. These acts did not stop the plague, but they preserved humanity within it. Time itself felt distorted. Days blurred together, marked not by tasks but by deaths. A week without illness felt miraculous. A single healthy night felt like a gift. Sleep, already fragile in medieval life, became restless and haunted. Dreams were filled with images of loss. Waking brought relief and dread. For peasants, living during the plague meant accepting uncertainty as permanent. Plans stopped extending far into the future. Survival narrowed into short horizons: today, tomorrow, maybe the next week. Long-term thinking felt pointless in a world where life could vanish overnight. As months turned into years, something unexpected happened. People noticed that entire families were gone. Entire farms stood empty. Land lay useless. Where scarcity once ruled, absence now dominated. And slowly, quietly, the balance between labor and power began to shift. Those who lived through the plague did not emerge stronger in body, but many emerged changed in mind. They had seen systems fail. They had seen authority flee. They had learned that survival sometimes came not from obedience, but from adaptation. Living with death stripped life to its core. It taught peasants what truly mattered and what did not. And when the worst finally passed, when death loosened its grip just enough to breathe again, peasants stepped into a world forever altered, one where survival brought something unexpected with it: leverage. The plague had taken millions, but it had also cracked the foundations of the old order.
Chapter 7. Medicine Without Science: Belief, Blood, and Prayer. When sickness struck a medieval peasant, there was no doctor waiting, no diagnosis, no medicine grounded in science. There was only belief, layered, ancient, inherited belief, stitched together from religion, superstition, fragments of classical texts, and fear. During the age of plague, famine, and constant illness, medicine was not a system of cures, it was a system of hope. To understand how peasants survived sickness, one must first understand what they believed caused it. Disease was not microscopic, it was moral, spiritual, or environmental. Illness came from God's displeasure, from corrupted air, from imbalance within the body, or from unseen forces that moved through the night. A cough was not just a cough, it might be a warning. A fever might be punishment. A sudden death might be proof of sin. This worldview shaped every medical response. At the center of medieval medicine stood the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health meant balance, disease meant excess. A peasant did not ask, "What infection do I have?" They asked, "Which part of me is overflowing?" Too much blood caused fevers. Too much black bile caused despair. Treatments were designed not to heal, but to rebalance. The most common response was bloodletting. A village barber, often the closest thing to a medical professional, would open a vein with a knife or leech. Blood flowed into bowls. Weakness followed. Sometimes the patient died. Sometimes they lived. Survival was credited to the treatment. Death was blamed on God's will. The practice continued for centuries because outcomes were interpreted through belief, not evidence. Herbal remedies filled the gaps where blood could not explain pain. Peasant medicine relied heavily on plants: garlic for infection, honey for wounds, willow bark for pain, mint for digestion. These remedies sometimes worked, not because of magic, but because nature quietly carried real medicinal properties. Peasants did not know why they worked, they only knew that sometimes they did. The line between healer and witch was thin. Village wise women or cunning folk were often the most effective caregivers. They understood childbirth, fevers, and basic wound care through experience, but their knowledge made them dangerous in times of fear. If a treatment failed, suspicion followed. Healing could turn into accusation overnight. Prayer was never optional. Every illness was wrapped in religious ritual. Psalms were spoken over beds. Holy water was sprinkled. Candles were lit for saints associated with healing. Saint Roch for plague, Saint Sebastian for sudden illness, Saint Apollonia for tooth pain. Faith was medicine, and doubt was dangerous. During the plague, prayer intensified. Entire villages marched barefoot in processions, whipping their own backs, begging God to stop the disease. These acts did not stop infection, but they offered structure in chaos. When science was absent, ritual gave meaning. Amulets were worn close to the skin. Written prayers were sewn into clothing. Bones of saints were carried or touched. Even the illiterate believed words held power if placed near the heart. Protection was not physical, it was symbolic. Smell mattered deeply. Bad air or miasma was believed to cause disease. Rotting matter, foul odors, stagnant places, these were feared. Ironically, this belief sometimes helped. People avoided filthy areas and burned herbs to cleanse air. Fires were kept burning. Houses were aired when possible. The reasoning was wrong, but some results were accidentally helpful. Yet much medieval medicine caused harm. Treatments often weakened already fragile bodies. Starving patients were bled. Dehydrated patients were purged. Children were dosed with dangerous mixtures. The goal was not comfort, it was correction. Pain was expected. Suffering was normal. Hospitals, when they existed, were places of last resort. Often run by monasteries, they focused more on spiritual preparation than recovery. To enter a hospital was to accept that death was likely. And still, people survived. Not because of medicine, but despite it. Bodies endured, immune systems adapted, luck played its part. Peasants learned which remedies seemed less deadly. Experience slowly shaped practice, even without theory. Medicine without science forced peasants to rely on community. Care was shared, the sick were watched, food was brought when possible. Children learned early how to tend wounds, boil water, and recognize danger signs, even if they didn't understand them. This chapter of survival was not heroic. It was quiet, painful, uncertain. But within it lay something important: observation. Over generations, peasants noticed patterns. They remembered which herbs soothed pain, which practices worsened sickness, which prayers comforted the dying. Knowledge accumulated, not in books, but in memory. And as plague, famine, and feudal pressure continued to reshape the medieval world, this lived knowledge would matter more than theories written by distant scholars. Because survival for peasants was never about understanding everything. It was about enduring long enough to pass something
anything forward. Chapter 8. Faith as Survival, God, Guilt, and the Church. For the medieval peasant, faith was not a separate part of life, it was life itself. From the moment of birth to the final breath, God framed every experience: joy, hunger, sickness, and survival. In a world where death arrived without warning and suffering had no clear explanation, religion was not merely belief. It was structure, comfort, fear, and meaning combined into one powerful force. After medicine failed, after food ran out, after plague carried away neighbors and family, faith remained the last refuge, not because it promised safety, but because it promised reason. The Church taught that the world operated under divine order. Nothing happened by accident. Famine was not climate failure, it was correction. Plague was not disease, it was judgment. Lords ruled not only by force, but by God's permission. To question suffering was to question God himself, a dangerous thought in any century, but especially in one without alternatives. For peasants, this belief system was a burden and a lifeline. Every Sunday, villagers gathered inside cold stone churches. Candles flickered against walls blackened by smoke. Latin words echoed, unintelligible to most, but the ritual itself mattered. Kneeling together reminded peasants they were not alone. Suffering shared felt lighter, even briefly. The church calendar shaped time itself. Feast days brought rare moments of rest and celebration. Fasting days reinforced discipline. Saints' days offered hope. In a life with little control, ritual created rhythm. Yet faith also carried guilt. Peasants were taught that suffering reflected sin, either personal or collective. When crops failed, they searched their consciences. Had someone broken God's law? Had the village angered heaven? Confession became survival. To confess was to lighten not just the soul, but fear itself. During the plague years, guilt intensified. Entire communities believed they deserved punishment. Some turned inward, becoming more devout. Others turned outward, seeking someone to blame. Outsiders, minorities, healers, and the poor were often accused of offending God or consorting with evil. Faith that once comforted could also divide. The church was powerful, but distant.
Local priests were often peasants themselves, barely educated, struggling to explain divine mysteries they did not fully understand. They offered what they could: prayers, blessings, last rites. For many, these rituals mattered more than cures. To die unshriven was worse than death itself. It meant eternal suffering. Monasteries stood as rare places of relative stability. Monks preserved knowledge, cared for the sick, fed the poor when possible. To a starving peasant, the monastery gates symbolized mercy. But even monasteries could not feed everyone. Charity had limits. Despite its power, the church did not always protect peasants from exploitation. Lords justified harsh rule through divine right. Obedience was framed as holy duty. Rebellion was sin. Faith encouraged endurance, not resistance. And yet, within faith lived quiet strength. Prayer gave peasants words when no answers existed. Hymns carried emotion where language failed. The idea of heaven, of rest beyond suffering, made unbearable lives survivable. Hope did not erase hunger, but it softened despair. Children learned prayers before they learned letters. Elderly peasants clung to rosaries as hands weakened. Faith passed silently between generations, not as theology, but as instinct. For modern audiences, accustomed to choice, explanation, and control, this reliance on faith may seem passive. But for medieval peasants, belief was not ignorance, it was adaptation. When the world offered no clarity, faith offered continuity. Faith did not stop the plague,
It did not end famine. It did not dismantle feudal chains. But it helped peasants wake up again after loss. And sometimes, in a dark church lit by a single flame, surrounded by others who endured the same fear, faith did what nothing else could. It reminded them they were still human. As the medieval world continued to strain under disease, hunger, and lordly power, this spiritual endurance would remain one of the strongest, if invisible, tools of survival. Because when everything else failed, belief filled the silence left behind. Chapter 9. Homes of Smoke and Straw. Peasant Living Conditions. For the medieval peasant, survival did not end outside the fields or the church doors. It followed them home, into dwellings that were never designed for comfort, privacy, or health, but simply for endurance. These homes, built of mud, timber, straw, and hope, reflected the fragile line peasants walked between life and death. A peasant's house was usually a single-room structure, low to the ground, with walls made from wattle and daub, woven wooden sticks packed with mud, clay, straw, and animal dung. The roof was thick thatch, good at keeping rain out, but perfect for harboring insects, rodents, and decay. Smoke-blackened and sagging with age, these homes blended into the landscape, almost indistinguishable from the earth itself. Inside, light was scarce. Windows were rare and small, often nothing more than holes covered with cloth or animal skin. Glass was a luxury reserved for churches and the wealthy. During the day, faint sunlight crept in. At night, darkness ruled, broken only by the dim glow of a hearth fire. That fire was the heart of the home. It cooked meals, provided warmth, and served as the only defense against winter cold. But it had no chimney. Smoke filled the room, curling along the ceiling before slowly escaping through gaps in the roof. Eyes burned, lungs suffered. Over years, smoke damage hardened breathing and shortened lives. Yet without fire, survival was impossible. Humans and animals shared this space. Chickens, pigs, goats, and sometimes cattle slept indoors, especially in winter. Their body heat helped warm the room. Their presence also brought fleas, lice, disease, and filth. But separating animals from humans was a luxury peasants could not afford. Survival demanded closeness. Furniture was minimal: a rough wooden table, maybe a bench, a few stools if the family was lucky. Beds were straw pallets on the floor, shared by multiple family members. Privacy did not exist. Children grew up hearing every cough, prayer, argument, and nightmare. Cleanliness was relative. Water had to be carried from wells or streams. Bathing was rare, not because peasants were ignorant, but because it was impractical. Cold water, limited fuel, and constant labor left little energy for washing. Clothes were worn until threadbare. Parasites were common companions. In winter, cold crept in relentlessly. The thatched roof insulated poorly. Wind found its way through every crack. Frost formed on interior walls. Families slept close together, wrapped in coarse wool blankets, breathing air thick with smoke and dampness. In summer, the same house became suffocating. Heat, insects, and rot filled the air. Food spoiled quickly. Disease spread easily. The home offered shelter, but never relief. And yet these homes were not loveless places. Within them, stories were told by firelight. Elders passed down memory and warning. Mothers soothed children through hunger and illness. Hymns were sung softly at night, not for entertainment, but for comfort. In a world that offered little safety, the home became a fragile sanctuary. When plague arrived, these conditions turned deadly. Crowded spaces accelerated infection. Rats thrived in thatch and straw. Fleas moved easily between animals and humans. Smoke-weakened lungs had little defense. Homes that once sheltered became silent traps of disease and grief. After loss, survivors remained. The same walls that witnessed death also witnessed endurance. Houses were repaired, not replaced. Straw was renewed. Fires were relit. Life resumed because it had to. To modernize, these homes seem unbearable, but to medieval peasants, they were familiar. They were not judged against comfort, but against exposure. A roof, even a fragile one, meant survival another night. These homes shaped the peasant mind as much as the body. Living in constant closeness taught resilience, patience, and emotional restraint. There was no escape from hardship, but also no isolation from family. As the centuries passed, little changed. Lords lived in stone halls, peasants lived close to earth. The divide was visible in architecture alone. And still, from smoke-filled rooms and straw-strewn floors, peasants rose each morning to face fields, famine, and fate. Because survival did not require comfort. It required endurance, and a place to return to when the day was done.
Chapter 10. Work until collapse. Endless labor and seasons. For the medieval peasant, life was measured not in years, but in seasons, and every season demanded work that pushed the body toward exhaustion. From the first breath of spring to the frozen silence of winter, labor was constant, unavoidable, and often merciless. Rest was not a right, it was an accident of weather, illness, or death. Work began early. Before sunrise, peasants rose from straw beds, lungs already heavy from smoke-filled nights. There were no clocks, only daylight and hunger. In spring, the soil had to be broken and turned by hand or wooden plow. Oxen were rare for the poorest families, so human muscle replaced animal strength. Fields that had fed generations demanded the same tribute each year: aching backs, blistered hands, and knees ground raw by earth and stone. Plowing was only the beginning. Seeds had to be sown carefully, evenly, and quickly. Too slow, and the season would pass. Too careless, and hunger would follow months later. Every motion mattered. Every mistake carried consequences, delayed, but devastating. Summer brought no relief. Long days stretched endlessly, filled with weeding, repairing fences, tending animals, and preparing tools. The sun burned exposed skin. Dehydration was common. There was no shade in open fields, no pause except when muscles refused to move. Children worked beside adults as soon as they could walk steadily. Childhood was brief. Usefulness defined worth. Women labored without recognition. In addition to field work, they cooked, carried water, spun wool, repaired clothing, cared for children, and tended animals. Pregnancy did not excuse labor. Birth did not guarantee rest. Many women returned to work days after childbirth, carrying infants into fields or leaving them behind in fragile care. Autumn was the most unforgiving season. Harvest determined survival. Crops had to be gathered before rain, rot, or theft. Entire villages worked from dawn until darkness, cutting grain with sickles, bundling sheaves, threshing by hand. Exhaustion was irrelevant. Hunger waited impatiently. Failure during harvest meant famine. Winter, often imagined as rest, brought its own hardships. Fields slept, but labor did not end. Wood had to be gathered, tools repaired, animals fed, bread baked sparingly from precious grain stores. Cold seeped into bones already weakened by years of strain. Many peasants died not from starvation, from exhaustion combined with cold. Above all this stood feudal obligation. Peasants did not work only for themselves. They owed labor to their lord, days spent on the lord's land instead of their own. This unpaid labor, known as corvée, stole time critical for survival. Refusal meant punishment. Delay meant debt. The Lord's harvest was protected. The peasant's was negotiable. The body paid the price. By middle age, many peasants were already broken. Bent spines, damaged joints, missing teeth, chronic pain. These were normal. Few lived past their 40s. Those who did carried visible evidence of decades spent fighting soil and seasons. There was no concept of burnout, only collapse. When the body failed, the family suffered. There was no safety net, no stored wealth, no replacement worker. Illness or injury could destroy an entire household within weeks. And yet, peasants worked on, not because they believed life would improve, but because stopping guaranteed death. Labor was survival itself. Movement was resistance against hunger, cold, and the slow erosion of hope. In rare moments there was rhythm, the sound of sickles cutting grain together, the shared silence of early morning fields, songs sung softly to keep pace and distract from pain. These moments did not erase hardship, but they made it bearable. From a modern distance, this life appears cruel and unrelenting, but to the peasant it was normal. They did not dream of rest as we understand it. They dreamed of enough food, enough strength, enough time to see another season. Work was not a job, it was life's condition, and as long as the seasons turned, the peasant bent their body to meet them, until the earth finally claimed them in return.
Chapter 11. Women, Children, and Shared Suffering. In the medieval village, the struggle of survival was not borne equally, yet it was shared. While men labored from dawn to dusk in the fields, women and children carried burdens just as heavy, often invisible to the eyes of outsiders. The daily rhythm of the peasant household was a choreography of necessity, pain, and endurance, where each member's suffering intertwined with the others, creating a fragile web that held the family together. Women were the backbone of the household, but their strength was taken for granted. Before sunrise, they rose to fetch water from the well, sometimes a mile away, carrying heavy wooden buckets. Then came the preparation of meals, not a matter of choice but survival. Simple grains had to be ground into flour using a hand mill, mixed with water or milk, and baked in the communal oven, if one existed. Every loaf represented hours of labor, and every mistake meant hunger later. While men tended the crops or livestock, women spun wool for clothing, repaired worn garments, churned butter, tended vegetable gardens, and cared for sick family members. Pregnancy, childbirth, or illness did not exempt them from this cycle. Instead, they worked through it, often with infants at their side. Children's lives were shaped by necessity far more than play. From the moment they could walk, they were apprenticed into labor. Toddlers were tasked with feeding smaller animals, gathering firewood, or carrying water. By age 6 or 7, they worked alongside their parents in the fields. Play existed in stolen moments, chasing a stray chicken, kicking a ball of rags, or whispering secrets in a barn loft, but it was rare and fragile. Education, as understood today, was limited. Reading was for the privileged. The stories children learned were those of survival, passed orally from parents and elders. Shared suffering created bonds, but it also tested the limits of endurance. Families were tightly knit, yet under the weight of famine, disease, and harsh winters, frictions flared. Parents worried not only for themselves, but for each child. Every cough, every skipped meal, every bruise could mean disaster. A cold, wet winter could push a child to the brink of illness. A late harvest could starve the whole household. Yet, even in these moments of despair, cooperation was essential. Tasks were divided according to strength and skill. Older siblings watched over younger ones. Mothers and fathers shared the heaviest loads, both physical and emotional. Relief was rare but powerful. On Sundays or feast days, families might glimpse a respite from relentless labor.
They attended church, prayed together, and listened to sermons or local legends that offered hope or moral instruction. During these times, children could momentarily escape work, and mothers could share news with neighbors while men tended the animals or repaired tools. Such small rituals strengthened the community and reaffirmed the fragile social fabric that survival demanded. The plague, famine, and feudal obligations affected all members of the household, but women and children often bore the most invisible suffering. While men confronted the fields and lords, women confronted the continuous domestic grind, and children faced the daunting prospect of life's harsh lessons from the earliest age. They shared the same hunger, the same cold, the same fear of illness, yet the weight of expectation was uniquely heavy for them. Stories passed down through generations reflected this shared suffering. Tales of resilience, of mothers protecting children from starvation, of siblings helping one another through illness, were both warnings and lessons. They reminded every family member of their interconnected fates. No one survived alone, and no one thrived without the other's strength. In the quiet of night, after the fire had dimmed and the household lay exhausted, the shared suffering became a kind of unspoken solidarity. Children slept close to their mothers or siblings for warmth. Mothers whispered prayers over small, sickly bodies, hoping to stave off death. Fathers reflected on the day's work, calculating the next day's tasks, knowing that the survival of their household depended on every person playing their part. This interweaving of labor, suffering, and care created a rhythm of life that defined the medieval peasant existence. It was grueling, unrelenting, and often fatal, but it was also profoundly human. The bonds forged in shared hardship became the invisible scaffolding that allowed families to endure plague, famine, and the rigid constraints of feudal rule. Even in moments of extreme hardship, these relationships offered lessons in resilience. Children learned early the value of cooperation. Women discovered resourcefulness that transcended the limits of scarcity, and men understood, however grudgingly, that their labor alone was insufficient without the unacknowledged work of their families. By witnessing the endurance of women and children, one realizes that survival in medieval times was never an individual pursuit. It was a collective endeavor, where suffering, strength, and hope intertwined, preparing each generation to continue the ceaseless struggle against hunger, disease, and oppression. Chapter 12: Punishment, Law, and Public Fear. In the medieval village, survival was never just a matter of toil, weather, or famine. It was equally dictated by the looming presence of law, punishment, and fear. For peasants living under feudal rule, justice was not blind, impartial, or codified in ways that we understand today. Instead, it was a public spectacle, a social instrument of control, wielded by lords, bailiffs, and local authorities. The village itself became a stage where obedience was demanded, fear was instilled, and memory of punishment served as a silent yet constant teacher. The peasant's life was a precarious balance between labor and law. Every step, every misstep carried consequences. A field left untilled, a sheep lost or stolen, or a disagreement with a neighbor could escalate quickly to the lord's attention. Fines, flogging, or worse awaited, often carried out in front of the entire community. The stocks or pillory were not merely punitive, they were performative, designed to humiliate and remind all villagers of their lowly status. Imagine standing in the town square, exposed to ridicule while the cold wind cut through your clothes, a wooden frame locking your head and hands in place. Neighbors would watch, whispering tales of the punished, and children would absorb the lesson. Survival depended not only on labor and resourcefulness, but on obedience and vigilance.
Crimes, real or perceived, were met with harsh and immediate consequences. Theft was a common accusation in times of famine, whether true or fabricated. Hunger drove desperate hands to snatch grain, and the law rarely questioned motive. Punishment could be as severe as amputation or branding, acts meant to serve both as deterrent and warning. Violence, when enacted publicly, reinforced the social hierarchy. Lords reminded peasants that their survival was contingent upon compliance, and the weight of this knowledge pressed on every household, subtly shaping daily decisions. Feudal justice was intertwined with superstition and fear. Misfortune or illness could be interpreted as divine punishment, and accusations of witchcraft or heresy often served to explain the unexplainable. A sudden plague outbreak, a failed harvest, or a child's illness could be blamed on the malicious intent of a neighbor or outsider. The church reinforced these interpretations, reminding peasants that sin and disobedience could bring divine wrath upon the community. Fear, in this sense, was both spiritual and temporal, extending the Lord's control and deepening peasant anxiety. Village courts, held irregularly, were ceremonies of tension. The lord or his steward presided, often in a hall warmed by a central hearth that belied the severity of proceedings. Witnesses were called, accusations aired, and sentences delivered, sometimes with brutal finality. Public executions, rare yet terrifyingly memorable, became folklore for the young and cautionary tales for adults. Every villager knew someone who had suffered publicly, and these stories etched themselves into communal consciousness, a constant reminder that law was inseparable from fear. For peasants, survival required navigation not just of the natural world, but of the legal one. Negotiating fines, appeasing lords, and avoiding accusations consumed as much mental energy as the fields and household chores. Even minor infractions could ripple through a family's livelihood, affecting rationed bread, livestock access, or labor obligations. The fear of punishment was a daily companion, shaping interactions, work habits, and strategies for appeasement. Children observed this system closely. The sight of a punished adult, whether a neighbor or relative, was both frightening and instructive. Through these observations, young peasants learned the intricate dance of obedience, when to speak, when to remain silent, and when to appeal to mercy. The lessons were subtle but powerful. Survival depended on understanding the rules, anticipating consequences, and navigating the Lord's whims with care. Yet fear did not solely stem from authority. It intertwined with natural calamities, disease, and famine. When the plague arrived or a harvest failed, the law still demanded payment of dues and obedience to labor obligations. Villagers were forced to endure compounded pressures, hunger, disease, and the constant threat of corporal or financial punishment. The intertwining of these forces created a psychological landscape where anxiety was endemic and resilience was forged from necessity. Despite the oppressive nature of law and punishment, communities developed subtle strategies for coping. Mutual aid networks, family alliances, and whispered negotiations softened the harshest impacts. Villagers learned to interpret the Lord's moods, anticipate market changes, and share resources discreetly. Survival became a complex web of obedience, cunning, and silent rebellion. Fear was a tool, yes, but it was also a catalyst for strategy, collaboration, and ingenuity. Even in the darkness of night, the shadow of punishment lingered. The village slept uneasily, knowing that the day might bring unexpected judgment. Mothers warned children of misbehavior, not merely for propriety, but as a protective mechanism. Avoid the Lord's wrath, and survival is more likely. Fathers reminded sons to respect authority, while quietly planning workarounds that might ease burdens. Fear shaped rhythm, routines, and relationships, embedding itself in every corner of peasant life. Through these harsh experiences, peasants developed an acute sense of social awareness and strategic thinking.
Every interaction had potential consequences. Every word could trigger suspicion. Every act could demand restitution. In a world where punishment and law were inseparable from life, fear became both a survival mechanism and a defining aspect of medieval existence.
Chapter 13. Revolt and Silence. Why Most Never Rebelled. In the previous chapters, we have followed lives shaped by hunger, disease, crushing labor, and relentless obligation. The weight of taxes, the fear of famine, and the certainty of hardship pressed down on ordinary people year after year. From this suffering, a question naturally emerges. Why did so few rebel? This chapter is the story of that silence. Medieval peasants were not unaware of rebellion. News of uprisings traveled between villages and regions, carried by traders, pilgrims, and soldiers. Yet for most people, revolt was not a path to freedom, but a gamble with everything they owned. Fear ruled their decisions, not only fear of punishment, but fear of losing land, home, family, and the fragile security that allowed them to survive another season. Rebellion promised uncertainty. Lords possessed organized armies, legal authority, and brutal methods of control. Peasants, by contrast, were exhausted, poorly armed, and divided. Most revolts failed, and their consequences were severe: executions, collective punishment, burned villages, and generations marked by trauma. The memory of these failures spread faster than hope. Religion and social order reinforced this silence. Many were taught that suffering was part of God's will, a test to be endured rather than resisted. Obedience became a moral duty, while rebellion was framed as sin. These beliefs did not erase anger, but they buried it deep beneath layers of resignation and faith. Yet silence did not mean acceptance. Resistance often took quieter forms, working slowly, hiding harvests, bending rules, or passing unspoken warnings to neighbors. Survival itself became an act of defiance. Instead of open rebellion, many chose endurance, hoping that time, change, or the next generation might bring relief.
Chapter 14. Community as Armor. How Villages Survived Together. In the bleak expanse of medieval Europe, survival was never solely an individual endeavor. For peasants, the harshness of the natural world, the weight of feudal obligations, recurring famine, and the looming shadow of plague made life precarious. Yet amidst this uncertainty, one unifying truth emerged. The village was not just a collection of huts and fields, it was a living organism, a source of resilience, and often the only defense against the forces that threatened to annihilate them. In a world where every misstep could mean starvation, punishment, or death, community became both armor and lifeline. From the first light of dawn, life in a medieval village was intrinsically intertwined. Families did not operate in isolation. Fields were plowed collectively, barns filled together, and meager harvests shared according to need and social obligation. When a plague struck or a harsh winter descended, neighbors relied on one another to share grain, water, and firewood. This cooperation was not merely a moral choice, it was practical. A single household without allies could face ruin in weeks, whereas a well-connected network could weather a season of scarcity. Children played roles within this ecosystem early on. Beyond simple chores, they learned essential survival skills through observation and participation. They carried water in pairs, herded animals collectively, and delivered messages across households. These routines were as much about maintaining the village's cohesion as they were about teaching competence. Even storytelling, which often appeared whimsical or entertaining, served a pragmatic function, preserving communal memory, transmitting practical wisdom, and reminding villagers of shared values and lessons from past hardships. The oral tradition was an invisible thread binding the community, connecting generations, and fortifying the social fabric.
Shared labor was a cornerstone of village resilience. During sowing and harvest, peasants would form work parties, swarms of hands moving through the fields, driven not just by efficiency but necessity. These collective efforts minimized exposure to predators, ensured fair distribution of scarce food, and created a network of accountability. Everyone knew that neglecting duties could imperil not just the individual, but entire families and even neighbors. A missed task could lead to public censure, fines, or loss of rationed grain, so social cohesion was enforced subtly yet powerfully. Beyond labor, communal living mitigated the psychological toll of constant uncertainty. The night was long, dark, and perilous, especially during the winter solstice when darkness dominated 17 hours of the day. Alone, the cold and fear could crush a spirit. Together, villagers huddled by central hearths, sharing warmth, stories, and song. Fear of wolves, thieves, or plague was diffused in numbers. Families gathered to recount legends, moral tales, or personal experiences, embedding survival strategies within these narratives. The story became armor as much as entertainment. Religion and ritual further reinforced communal bonds. Weekly gatherings at the church, prayers, or small local ceremonies offered shared reassurance. The church bell marked the rhythm of life, signaling labor, meals, or emergencies. Through these rituals, villagers reaffirmed social hierarchies while simultaneously reinforcing mutual dependence. Even in a feudal system that emphasized control, these communal structures provided a buffer against the harshest inequities. Shared spiritual practices created emotional resilience, allowing peasants to interpret misfortune collectively rather than alone, a critical advantage when facing famine, disease, or the unpredictability of lords' demands. Conflict within the village existed, of course. Arguments over water rights, land boundaries, or livestock disputes arose frequently. Yet even these conflicts were tempered by the knowledge that cooperation was essential for survival. A quarrel unchecked could weaken the village's collective capacity to endure a poor harvest or defend against external threats. Peacemaking, negotiation, and the subtle diplomacy of elders became central skills. Village elders, often those with the most experience surviving consecutive seasons of hardship, acted as mediators, advisors, and organizers. Their authority was informal but deeply respected, grounded in lived knowledge rather than formal law. When disease struck, communal strategies became literal lifelines. During plague outbreaks, entire families were quarantined, sometimes voluntarily, often guided by collective knowledge about contagion. Communities organized supply chains to ensure that the sick received food and water, even while fear lingered. Shared awareness of which families were affected helped limit spread. This vigilance, passed through word of mouth rather than scientific understanding, demonstrated the ingenuity of peasants navigating mortal threats with limited tools. Even leisure was social. Festivals, seasonal fairs, or market days provided crucial opportunities for exchange, not just of goods, but of information. News of weather, crop conditions, lordly edicts, or outbreaks of disease traveled faster when networks were dense. Storytelling, music, and communal play reinforced relationships while subtly preparing villagers for hardships. The social glue of shared experiences enhanced adaptability and resilience, making the village more than a physical settlement. It became a cognitive and emotional support system. Food, the most tangible concern, was managed collectively in many villages. Grain storage, communal ovens, and shared herds allowed for rationing when scarcity struck. Families without personal reserves could survive by participating in communal labor or exchange networks. Villagers became adept at assessing risk collectively, deciding which fields to sow, when to hunt or gather, and how to distribute meager yields. Survival depended not just on individual skill, but on collective wisdom, passed down through generations. In essence, the medieval village functioned as a self-reinforcing ecosystem. Fear, labor, ritual, and shared knowledge coexisted, creating a system of checks and balances that allowed life to persist despite relentless adversity. Every household contributed to and relied upon this network, and each season's success or failure was measured in communal terms rather than individual gain alone. The social fabric, fragile yet resilient, was the ultimate armor against the uncertainties of feudal existence. By the time dusk fell and the long winter nights stretched ahead, the village remained a unit of survival. Huddled together against the cold and dark, they whispered stories, shared warmth, and reinforced the lessons of generations. The plague, famine, and lords could threaten their lives, but the bonds of community provided a protective layer, a buffer against isolation and despair. In this way, medieval peasants turned collective living into a strategic advantage, proving that survival was rarely about the strongest individual. It was about the village as a whole.
Chapter 15. Winter, the true enemy. As the last leaves fell and the chill of autumn gave way to the merciless grip of winter, peasants across medieval Europe faced an enemy far more relentless than any lord, bandit, or disease: the winter itself. In a time before central heating, insulated homes, or modern food storage, the cold was both a physical and psychological adversary, shaping daily life, social structures, and survival strategies in ways that modern audiences might scarcely imagine. For a peasant, the first frost was a warning, the first snow a herald of months where the world became a shadowed, frozen landscape, and survival demanded ingenuity, endurance, and a communal spirit unlike any other. Winter was not merely a season, it was a prolonged test of human resilience. In Northern Europe, daylight could last barely 7 hours, leaving 17 hours of darkness for villagers to endure. These hours were not idle. The long nights amplified every sound: the howl of wolves at the forest edge, the creak of frost-strained rooftops, and the ominous wind that rattled fragile wooden shutters. Sleep, already precarious, became intermittent. Peasants often huddled together for warmth, relying on shared body heat to stave off frostbite. Children learned early to value the warmth of a neighbor's fire as much as their own family hearth. Food scarcity intensified during winter, turning the kitchen into a theater of strategy and rationing. Harvests stored in underground pits, clay jars, and wooden granaries had to be carefully divided. A single misjudgment, burning too much firewood, overcooking a ration, or eating grain meant for seed, could jeopardize survival for weeks. Winter required not only physical labor, but precise planning and foresight, skills honed over generations. Peasants preserved root vegetables, salted meats, and dried grains, often inventing makeshift solutions when supplies dwindled. Every meal became a lesson in moderation, resourcefulness, and patience. The cold also affected mobility and labor. Frozen soil, snow-covered fields, and icy roads made work grueling. Animals, too, suffered, requiring extra feed and constant care. Villagers would wake before dawn to feed livestock, chop firewood, and ensure that water sources had not frozen over completely. In some regions, wells were carefully insulated with straw, while in others, villagers risked falling through thin ice to fetch water. The daily routine transformed into a battle against nature itself, with survival often hanging on small but crucial decisions. Psychologically, winter cast a shadow over communal life. Extended darkness fostered superstition, ritual, and folklore. Stories of spirits, winter beasts, or the capricious old winter circulated widely, often teaching caution or reinforcing social norms. Storytelling became both a distraction and a survival tool, keeping the community alert, mentally engaged, and emotionally connected. Songs, prayers, and shared legends provided comfort, reminding everyone that the unseen forces of winter could be endured through unity, wit, and vigilance. Disease, already a lingering threat, intensified in winter months. Cold weakened the body, while smoke-filled cottages, necessary for warmth, created indoor pollution that exacerbated respiratory illnesses. Poor nutrition left peasants vulnerable to ailments like scurvy, frostbite infections, and fevers. Yet, despite these dangers, communities had developed coping mechanisms. Elders taught herbal remedies, shared knowledge about conserving heat, and organized communal watches to prevent theft or predation. These measures, though primitive by modern standards, often meant the difference between survival and death. Social hierarchies became both more rigid and more negotiable during winter. Lords demanded tithes and labor, yet they too were constrained by the season. Travel was dangerous, crops unyielding, and taxes sometimes collected in kind rather than coin. Villagers leveraged this necessity to negotiate small reprieves or trade favors, balancing obedience with pragmatic survival. In essence, winter leveled disparities. Both lord and peasant faced the cold, and only those who respected natural limits endured. Communal rituals reached their zenith during the harsh months. Festivals such as Yule, midwinter feasts, and religious observances provided psychological relief and reinforced bonds. Fire, song, and dance transformed the cold nights into moments of warmth, laughter, and solidarity. Villagers who survived together in these winters remembered the shared hardships and the shared joys, embedding these lessons into stories that would be told for generations, an oral history that modern audiences can still glimpse today. Even the architecture reflected adaptation to winter's tyranny. Thatched roofs were reinforced with extra straw, walls insulated with mud and dung, and floors layered with rushes to trap heat. Smoke holes allowed fires to vent while retaining warmth, and communal ovens provided central points for cooking, baking, and gathering. Each village displayed a subtle but deliberate understanding of how human ingenuity could mitigate nature's harshest trials. Winter was also a teacher in patience and resilience. It shaped rhythms of work, leisure, and rest, emphasizing foresight and cooperation. Villagers learned to anticipate shortages, preserve resources, and collaborate to survive months of scarcity. The knowledge gained from surviving winter informed planting schedules, food storage, and social strategies throughout the rest of the year. Each season built upon the last, ensuring that the harshest months were also the most instructive. By the end of winter, peasants who had endured the frost emerged stronger, wiser, and more cohesive. The cold was not simply an enemy, it was a crucible that honed survival skills, strengthened community ties, and forged a collective memory. Tales of hardship and clever adaptation spread through villages, becoming part of the cultural legacy, stories that would ultimately influence folklore, song, and the shared consciousness of generations to come. In the medieval world, winter was the ultimate arbiter of life, a force as commanding as plague or famine. Yet, in its brutal embrace, humans discovered resilience, creativity, and unity. For modern audiences in the USA, UK, and Canada, these stories carry lessons not just about history, but about endurance, human connection, and the invisible armor built by shared hardship. The chill of medieval nights, the flickering of communal fires, and the weight of snow on thatched roofs form a cinematic tableau of survival, inviting reflection and admiration, even centuries later.
Chapter 16. Sleep, Fear, and the Medieval Night. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the long winter night settled over the village, darkness became more than a backdrop. It was a living presence, shaping every sound, movement, and emotion. For medieval peasants, sleep was neither a carefree rest nor a private refuge.
It was a cautious negotiation with the night, a time when fear, superstition, and survival instincts intertwined, creating a fragile balance between rest and vigilance. Unlike our modern world, illuminated by LEDs and warmed by central heating, medieval nights were absolute, black, cold, and endlessly long, especially during the winter months. The world of the dark demanded awareness, resourcefulness, and a deep understanding of human vulnerability. The small cottages, built of timber, wattle, and daub, offered scant protection from the elements. Thatched roofs shivered under frost, gaps in walls allowed icy drafts, and the single hearth, though central, radiated uneven warmth. Peasants slept in tightly packed beds or on straw mattresses, often sharing space with children, elderly relatives, and sometimes livestock. The warmth of the body next to body was essential, not a comfort, but a lifeline. A sudden chill in the night could lead to frostbite or sickness. A poorly maintained fire could mean a freezing, sleepless night. Yet physical threats were only part of the story. The medieval mind was attuned to the spiritual and the supernatural. Shadows on the walls, the creak of a rafter, or the howl of a distant wolf were interpreted not merely as natural phenomena, but as messages, warnings, or omens. The mare, a malevolent spirit believed to sit on sleeping chests and bring nightmares, was feared by children and adults alike. Nightmares were not dismissed, they were scrutinized for meaning. A dream of a snake, a crow, or a flowing river could signal danger, death, or divine guidance. Sleep became a conscious act, one that demanded rituals, prayers, and protective measures. Religious faith permeated nightly routines. Families crossed themselves, recited prayers, or placed small charms near their beds. Candles, when available, were lit to ward off evil spirits and to provide a sense of control over the oppressive darkness. Church bells, ringing at dawn or during midnight vigils, provided auditory markers that anchored villagers in the passage of time, reminding them that they were not alone, even in the dead of night. The long hours of darkness also fostered storytelling and oral tradition. Elders shared tales of dragons, saints, and heroic ancestors, weaving moral lessons with practical survival advice. These stories were more than entertainment, they were psychological armor, offering courage, hope, and communal cohesion. Children learned about the dangers outside, while also understanding the protective role of their families and village structures. Each story was layered with information about plants, animals, weather patterns, and human behavior, all critical for surviving the night. Fear, while pervasive, was also a motivator. Villagers remained alert to threats from wild animals, bandits, and neighbors driven to desperation by famine or plague. Some kept small weapons close to hand, while others trained dogs to alert them to intruders. Survival depended not only on physical strength, but also on the ability to interpret signs and anticipate danger. In many ways, fear sharpened instincts, ensuring that each night passed with the fewest casualties possible. Sleep itself was segmented. The concept of a single, uninterrupted night of rest was foreign. Historians refer to the first sleep and second sleep, with villagers waking briefly during the night to pray, feed animals, or check on their children. These awakenings were not interruptions, they were integral to the rhythm of life, offering moments of reflection, problem-solving, or quiet bonding. Modern audiences might see this as restless or harsh, but for medieval peasants it was the natural cadence of life, honed over generations of necessity. Nutrition, or lack thereof, intensified the nocturnal struggle. Cold bodies, weakened by limited calories and months of inadequate nutrition, found it harder to stay warm and rested. The smallest comforts, a bowl of warm broth, a shared blanket, the proximity of a loved one, became precious rituals. Every night tested not just physical endurance, but emotional resilience. Families leaned on each other, creating a network of support that was both intimate and essential for survival. For those living under feudal obligations, sleep was also a matter of timing. Work duties, lordly inspections, and crop care often dictated nightly routines. Failure to anticipate or prepare for the next day could result in punishment, loss of food, or labor setbacks. Sleep was strategic, short, careful, and purposeful. Even in rest, peasants were attuned to the rhythms of labor, the whispers of the night, and the ever-present pressures of authority. The medieval night, then, was a crucible of human experience. Fear and imagination, physical necessity, and spiritual practice coalesced into a complex, layered life lived in darkness. It was a world where every sound mattered, every shadow held meaning, and every moment of warmth or companionship was precious. Modern audiences in the USA, UK, and Canada, accustomed to uninterrupted sleep and climate-controlled comfort, might struggle to imagine such conditions, but therein lies the power of history. The medieval night teaches us resilience, creativity, and the deep value of human connection. By the final hours of darkness, peasants who endured the night emerged not only alive, but prepared. They carried knowledge forward, lessons about trust, vigilance, and resourcefulness that would be shared with the next generation. Their fear, carefully managed, became a guide. Their sleep, structured by necessity, became a tool, and their lives, lived fully within the embrace of darkness, offer a cinematic, reflective vision for modern audiences to explore, learn from, and imagine themselves within.
Chapter 17: Superstition and Survival Psychology. In the flickering shadows of the medieval night, superstition was not mere fancy, it was a survival mechanism. For peasants living in England, Wessex, or across northern Europe, every unexplained sound, every sudden chill, every strange shadow could carry real consequences. Life in the 14th century was fragile. Disease, famine, and the whims of feudal lords made daily existence precarious. Superstition, rituals, and belief systems provided a framework to interpret a chaotic world, offering both psychological comfort and practical guidance. The peasants' understanding of causality was deeply intertwined with the unseen. Illness could come from bad air, from divine punishment, or from a malevolent spirit. Crop failures might result from a neighbor's curse, a restless ghost, or an angry deity. Such beliefs were far from irrational. They were informed by observation, tradition, and experience. If a neighbor's livestock fell ill, whispers might circulate that envy or witchcraft was at play. Acting upon such beliefs, whether by performing protective charms, reciting prayers, or altering planting routines, often had tangible benefits. At minimum, it fostered alertness and resourcefulness, both essential to survival. Children learned early to read the signs of the world around them. A black cat crossing the path, the sudden silence of birds, or the pattern of clouds were interpreted as messages. While modern audiences might dismiss these as quaint or absurd, for medieval peasants, recognizing and responding to these omens often prevented real danger. Wolves, bandits, or sudden storms were real threats. Superstition provided a way to prepare mentally and practically. A ritual that seemed mystical might actually encourage vigilance, ensuring doors were secured, fires were tended, or livestock were checked. Religious practices reinforced this psychology. The church wielded enormous influence, shaping how peasants interpreted life and death. Saints, relics, and holy water were not simply symbolic, they were tools for coping with uncertainty.
Nightly prayers, processions, and blessings before sleep offered reassurance and reduced anxiety. The concept of divine watchfulness instilled both fear and hope. Misfortune could be punishment for sin, but devotion might bring protection. In psychological terms, these practices reduced the sense of helplessness and gave structure to an otherwise unpredictable life. Superstitions often intersected with practical knowledge. For example, hanging certain herbs above doorways was believed to repel evil spirits, but herbs like rosemary or sage also contained natural antiseptic properties, deterring insects and disease. Carrying a small charm might have encouraged vigilance while walking alone at night. Dreams, taken seriously, provided a mental rehearsal for danger. A peasant who dreamed of fire might check the hearth or thatch before bed. A dream of wolves could lead to reinforcing fences or keeping children indoors. Superstition, psychology, and practical action were inseparable in this world. Even communal behavior reflected this blend of belief and survival instinct. Festivals, storytelling, and seasonal rituals strengthened village cohesion. Halloween-like traditions in October or rituals around the winter solstice weren't just celebratory. They reinforced knowledge of the environment, social bonds, and preparation for scarcity. By reinforcing memory and attention, these traditions subtly educated the young and reminded adults of risks in the surrounding environment. Psychologically, superstition reduced uncertainty and provided a sense of agency. Medieval peasants understood that the world was unpredictable, but belief in spirits, signs, and divine forces gave them a framework for action. Fear became manageable. Nighttime anxiety was channeled into rituals and preparation. Illness or misfortune, though unavoidable, could be contextualized within moral or supernatural frameworks, giving meaning to suffering and prompting proactive behavior. Modern audiences might find these behaviors fascinating. In the US, UK, or Canada, we live in a world of information, technology, and science, but the emotional strategies of medieval peasants reveal universal human instincts. The mind seeks patterns, explanation, and control. Superstition and ritual, while archaic in form, functioned as early survival psychology, tools for resilience, mental preparedness, and community stability. Even the smallest actions carried layered meanings. Placing a broom across the threshold might seem symbolic, but it reminded the family to secure the doorway. Carrying a talisman provided confidence and reduced hesitation in the face of real dangers. In a sense, superstition structured behavior, mitigated panic, and reinforced social norms, all vital for enduring plagues, famine, and the oppressive rule of lords. By integrating belief with daily practice, medieval peasants cultivated a mindset finely tuned to risk and opportunity. Their nights were dark, long, and psychologically demanding, but superstition provided a compass. Each ritual, each warning, each small act of precaution strengthened their capacity to survive, to endure, and to pass knowledge to the next generation. For contemporary viewers, the lesson is both historical and timeless. Understanding how humans adapt mentally to uncertainty offers insight not only into medieval life, but into our own instincts under stress. Superstition, psychology, and survival are intertwined, revealing the depth of human ingenuity when every day is a test of endurance. In the flickering candlelight, as peasants huddled together, whispered prayers mingled with practical measures. In that darkness, fear became awareness, belief became action, and superstition became survival. A perfect blend of mind and environment, where every night honed both body and spirit for the challenges yet to come.
Chapter 18. Small Joys in a Brutal World. Even in the harshest conditions, amid the relentless weight of famine, disease, and feudal oppression, medieval peasants discovered moments of simple joy. Life in 14th century England or across the European countryside was unrelentingly harsh. Hunger gnawed at the belly, winters chilled to the bone, and the threat of death from plague, wolves, or the whim of a lord lingered daily. Yet the human spirit, even in these bleak circumstances, sought reprieve in small, fleeting pleasures, and these moments became essential for survival, psychologically, emotionally, and socially. Peasant families, crowded into single-room cottages of straw, mud, and timber, found warmth not just from fires, but from one another. Children playing quietly by the hearth, even with the simplest toys made from scraps of wood, twine, or cloth, brought laughter that echoed across the small dwelling. For parents, seeing a child smile, hearing their giggles, or witnessing a small triumph in learning a skill was a brief, luminous relief from the oppressive challenges outside. The act of storytelling, passed down orally from parent to child, often after the day's labor, transformed nightly fear into shared wonder. Tales of clever animals, clever humans, or even legendary heroes like Beowulf or King Arthur allowed imagination to flourish, bridging the gap between reality and dreams. Food, meager as it often was, carried unexpected joy when shared. A thin loaf of rye bread might be broken carefully among family members, each receiving a portion and giving thanks. When a meal included a rare treat, such as salted fish, a handful of berries, or a bit of cheese, it became a celebration, a feast in miniature, fostering gratitude and reinforcing family bonds. Even for laborers at the bottom of the feudal system, such moments of communal eating, where stories and laughter mingled with sustenance, were psychologically nourishing. Seasonal events amplified these small joys. Harvest festivals, midsummer celebrations, and religious holidays were often the only occasions when peasants could relax their labor, adorn their homes with greenery, and gather as a community. Music, clapping, singing, and dancing, however rustic, provided emotional relief. These traditions, whether pagan-rooted midsummer games or Christian feast days, structured life around anticipation, offering breaks from monotony and danger. Even the sound of a simple wooden flute or the rhythmic beat of a drum provided a shared heartbeat for the village, a reminder that life persisted despite hardship. Work itself, while grueling, occasionally offered subtle moments of satisfaction. Successfully harvesting a full cart of wheat, repairing a fence without loss of livestock, or seeing a child master a task brought pride. Competence in craft, whether spinning, weaving, or blacksmithing, provided not only practical utility but a sense of accomplishment that sustained morale. Recognition from neighbors, even in small ways, an approving nod, a shared piece of advice, a smile, became social currency that buffered stress and reinforced community cohesion. Even the natural world offered solace. Peasants, intimately connected to the land, found beauty in everyday phenomena: the glimmer of frost on fields at dawn, the first green shoots of spring, birds returning after winter, or the occasional deer glimpsed at twilight. Observing and interpreting these signs allowed peasants to feel control, hope, and continuity in a world otherwise dominated by uncertainty. Nature was not only a resource, but also a quiet source of inspiration, meditation, and resilience. Religion, too, provided layered forms of joy. While fear of divine punishment and sin was ever present, rituals, prayers, and festivals also offered hope and comfort. Lighting a candle, making an offering, or attending Mass created small moments of spiritual fulfillment. Prayer offered reflection, and community worship reinforced social bonds, making life more bearable, even under the shadow of plague or famine. Children's games, often simple and inventive, were perhaps the most spontaneous sources of joy.
Improvised toys, races through muddy fields, or playful storytelling gave a brief escape from hunger, cold, or labor. These moments were more than entertainment. They trained agility, social cooperation, and emotional regulation, preparing the young for the demands of adult life. Art and craftsmanship also infused life with meaning. A beautifully carved wooden spoon, a simple embroidery, or a painted religious icon in the village chapel elevated daily existence, reminding peasants that even in the smallest corners, beauty could persist. Creativity, whether for practical or decorative purposes, was a rebellion against the monotony and brutality of daily life, fostering pride and identity. Importantly, humor, sometimes dark, sometimes absurd, pervaded daily life. Villagers often joked about local misfortunes, clever animals, or even the eccentricities of their lord. Laughter was a shared resource, strengthening bonds, alleviating stress, and reinforcing resilience. Stories passed down orally contained humor interwoven with moral lessons, subtly teaching the young how to navigate social hierarchies, avoid danger, and understand human behavior. Peasants' small joys were tightly interwoven with survival strategies. Social connection, shared experience, and emotional release buffered stress and mitigated despair. These moments reinforced resilience, maintained morale, and fostered a sense of continuity across generations. Modern viewers, particularly from the US, UK, or Canada, may recognize parallels. While contemporary lives lack the same immediacy of life or death hardship, the psychological principle persists. Humans, even in adversity, gravitate towards small, meaningful pleasures. Medieval peasants were masters of this, finding solace in family, play, work, storytelling, faith, and nature. In the shadow of plague, famine, and feudal oppression, small joys were a lifeline. They were the sparks that kept hope alive, the threads that stitched together the fabric of communal life, and the quiet victories that allowed peasants to endure, persist, and occasionally smile in a brutal world.
Chapter 19. What survival cost them. Survival in the medieval world came at a steep, relentless price. For peasants, enduring famine, plague, and the whims of feudal lords was not merely a test of physical endurance. It was a trial of the body, mind, and soul. Every day of life demanded sacrifices, and though they found fleeting joys, the cost of survival was etched in every aspect of existence. By examining the cumulative weight of hardship, we begin to understand how medieval peasants lived, what they lost, and what resilience truly demanded. Hunger was the first and most pervasive cost. A life of chronic scarcity shaped every decision. Grain stores were meager and uneven. A failed harvest could mean weeks or months of near starvation. Children often went without sufficient nutrition, leaving them weak and susceptible to disease. Adults, bent beneath the weight of labor, endured constant fatigue. Muscles wasted, energy dwindled, and the mind, fogged by hunger, struggled to solve even simple problems. Peasants rarely experienced full satiety, and what food they had was repetitive: rye bread, gruel, occasional vegetables, and the rare morsel of meat or fish. Their bodies bore the toll: stunted growth, worn teeth, chronic ailments, and a digestive system hardened by necessity, but fragile in crisis. Disease exacted another relentless cost. The Black Death, recurring plagues, and endemic infections wiped out entire families in a matter of weeks. Those who survived often carried scars, both physical and psychological. Skin lesions, swollen joints, and lingering fevers were common. Survivors lived with the constant knowledge that a sneeze, a cough, or a simple fever could be a death sentence. Yet without understanding of germs or immunity, every bout of illness was accompanied by superstition, prayer, or folk remedies. Some peasants lost family members, neighbors, or entire kin networks, leaving them isolated and socially vulnerable. Mental and emotional burdens weighed equally heavily. Constant vigilance against threats, wolves, bandits, or the cruelty of a lord created an ever-present tension. Fear of famine, illness, and punishment dictated daily routines. Dreams were often haunted by visions of death, fire, or starvation. Sleep, when it came, was never complete or restful. Nightmares could interrupt the precious hours of rest, and in a society without modern medicine or psychological understanding, anxiety and grief went largely untreated. Emotional resilience was forged by necessity, but exacted its price. The strain of continuous survival left peasants perpetually on edge. Labor, too, came at a steep cost. Work was unending and physically punishing. Fields demanded planting, tending, and harvesting in all weather conditions, sweltering summers, freezing winters, relentless rain, or blizzards. Broken tools, poor soil, or pests could obliterate weeks of effort. Even the simplest chores required strength, stamina, and coordination. Those who faltered often faced penalties from the lord or village authorities. Over time, bodies bent and stooped under years of toil. Joints ached, backs curved, and hands were calloused and cracked. Many adults did not live long enough to experience the lightness of age, as physical wear and tear combined with disease and malnutrition shortened life expectancy dramatically. Social costs compounded the physical and emotional toll. Feudal obligations demanded loyalty, labor, and tribute to lords who were often distant or indifferent. Failure to comply could result in fines, imprisonment, or violent punishment. Personal freedom was limited. Marriage, trade, and property rights were constrained, and peasants could rarely improve their social standing. Generational cycles of poverty meant that children were born into the same hardships their parents endured, perpetuating inequality and limiting opportunity. Cultural and intellectual deprivation was subtle but significant. While oral storytelling and religious instruction provided community cohesion, peasants had limited access to broader knowledge, learning, or artistic pursuits. Literacy was rare, and the ability to read or write, a power that could unlock understanding of law, history, or trade, was almost always inaccessible. Curiosity and intellect were constrained by survival needs. The mental energy devoted to securing food, shelter, and safety left little room for reflection or creativity. The spiritual cost was another invisible weight. Faith offered comfort, but it also demanded devotion, guilt, and fear. Confession, tithes, and ritual observances were non-negotiable. While belief in God and the Church provided hope and social structure, it also imposed a psychological burden. Every misfortune could be interpreted as divine punishment, reinforcing fear and self-doubt. Surviving meant negotiating both earthly and spiritual hierarchies, a continuous mental labor alongside the physical grind. Yet, despite these relentless costs, peasants endured. Their resilience was a testament to human adaptability. They formed cooperative networks, shared resources, and celebrated small triumphs. Children learned practical skills early. Women managed households with ingenuity, and men navigated dangerous labor with experience and intuition. Humor, storytelling, and faith became vital mechanisms for coping with adversity. In this sense, survival was not mere existence, it was an active, continuous negotiation with hardship, a deliberate act of persistence in a world stacked against them. Modern audiences, particularly from North America and Europe, may find these realities difficult to imagine. Comfortable homes, reliable food, medicine, and labor-saving technologies have insulated most people from such relentless pressures.
Yet examining the cost of survival in medieval times illuminates the sheer strength required to endure. Every day for a peasant was a delicate balance between life and death, fear and hope, labor and leisure. Understanding this context allows us to appreciate not only their hardships, but also the ingenuity, courage, and resilience that sustained generations through centuries of oppression, disease, and scarcity. Ultimately, the cost of survival shaped medieval peasants in every dimension, physically, mentally, emotionally, socially, and spiritually. It demanded sacrifice and endurance, yet it also forged a culture of resilience, community cohesion, and quiet strength. To survive was to live on the edge of possibility, where each day required negotiation, strategy, and courage, and where every small victory, whether a full meal, a healthy child, or a laugh around the hearth, was profoundly significant.
Chapter 20. Why Their Struggle Still Matters Today. As we reach the final chapter of this long journey through the lives of medieval peasants, it becomes clear that their story is not just history, it is a mirror reflecting the resilience, ingenuity, and spirit of humanity itself. The plagues that swept through villages, the famines that gnawed at stomachs, the feudal obligations that constrained freedom, and the endless labor under harsh seasons, all of these trials shaped lives in ways that are almost unimaginable to us today. Yet through every hardship, every loss, and every moment of fear, these ordinary people displayed an extraordinary tenacity. Their struggle matters today because it reminds us of the fragility and value of life. In a world where food, shelter, medicine, and security are often taken for granted, the medieval peasant's experience teaches humility, empathy, and gratitude. Their nights spent in near darkness, huddled by hearths with the sounds of the wild outside, were filled not just with survival, but with imagination, stories, songs, prayers, and shared laughter that gave meaning to hardship. These stories, passed orally through generations, are the roots of literature, folklore, and cultural memory. Every legend of dragons, every tale of courage, and every hymn of hope was born from their lived experience. We also see the power of community and shared struggle. In times of plague, famine, or harsh rule, villages survived not because of individual strength alone, but because of cooperation, mutual aid, and collective resilience. This lesson resonates strongly today. In moments of global crisis, whether pandemics, climate challenges, or social upheaval, the bonds of community and solidarity remain a lifeline. Medieval peasants remind us that survival is never solitary. It is a shared, human endeavor. Their struggle also matters because it highlights the evolution of knowledge and society. Medicine, sanitation, agriculture, and governance have advanced immeasurably since the Middle Ages, yet the underlying human needs, security, sustenance, belonging, remain constant. By understanding how our ancestors lived, we can better appreciate the innovations we now enjoy, the freedoms we often take for granted, and the responsibilities we carry to support one another. And finally, their story matters because it is alive in the rhythms of our modern world. We may light our nights with electricity, store food in refrigerators, and rely on global supply chains, but the same fears of scarcity, illness, and uncertainty echo faintly in every human heart. The peasants' resilience, patience, and creativity are not relics of a distant past. They are timeless lessons, whispering across centuries, urging us to endure, to create, and to value what truly matters. As you reflect on their lives, imagine the children learning at the feet of their parents, the families sharing meals of bread and gruel, the hushed prayers whispered into the dark, the songs and stories that carried hope through the long nights. These are the echoes of human endurance, and they still resonate today. By remembering them, we honor not just their struggles, but the universal quest for survival, dignity, and meaning that binds all generations. So, as the final page turns and the hearth fires fade into history, remember, the story of medieval peasants is not a tale confined to the past. It is a lens through which we see ourselves, our world, and the courage that continues to shape humanity. And if this journey has stirred your curiosity, keep watching, keep exploring, and discover the countless stories that history has yet to reveal. For in every shadow of the past, there is a light waiting to guide the present, and perhaps even the future. This is the end of their journey, but the legacy of survival, resilience, and human spirit lives on, and will continue to inspire every story yet to be told.